Want to strike out on your own and take on some freelance work, but wondering how to make it happen? Well, in today's Build episode, we'll walk you through, so stay tuned. Welcome to Build, the show that debunks a number of myths and misconceptions related to building products, companies, and your career in tech. I'm your host, Purnima Vijay Shankar. We all want a lot of freedom and flexibility in our careers. One approach to making that happen is to strike out on our own and become a freelancer. While it's easy to glamorize being our own boss, it can take a lot of time to get a business off the ground. You have to figure things out like how to market yourself, manage clients, price your services, and still have enough hours in the day to actually do the work. All of these tasks can leave you feeling overwhelmed. Well, fear not, because in today's Build episode, we're going to tackle how to deal with a number of these pieces. And to help us out, I've invited Greg Goldner, who is a freelance developer. Thanks for joining us, Greg.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be on the show.
Yeah. So you and I met about 2 years ago when I hired you to help out on a product I was working with. I was advising at the time. And one of the things that I was surprised to learn when we were chatting was that you had begun your career in software. Tell us, how did you get your start, or rather, what you were doing before you became a software developer?
Absolutely. Yeah. So before I went into software development, I was a teacher for 13 years. And a lot of people asked me at the time, so you were a teacher before? How does that make any sense that now you're in software development? Those things, they have nothing to do with each other. And to me, they had everything to do with each other. And it was such a sort of obvious transition. Now, mainly because my background is, as a kid, I had two sort of interests and loves. And I had computers, and since a young age, I was exposed to actually coding and computers and everything with that, and music. And so I was a musician, and I loved everything about performing and playing. And so when I was going to college, I was sort of in both camps. And so for me, those were not divergent subjects that were sort of so separate. They were two things that I loved. And my 18-year-old self really loved the idea of performing and playing in front of people, and then really got excited when I got to help people, students, people younger than me, kind of see what's so cool about creating something. And that was why I became a teacher in music. And then many years later, my priorities changed and things in life changed. And suddenly I thought, I really love creating things. That's what I loved. And creating things, it was not sort of unique to music for me. It was also something where I realized, I have this phone in my hand and I can create things that inspire people. And so for me, they weren't two different camps. They were two different ways to reach the sort of something that excites me, which is creating something new and exciting and fresh that people love. And so for me, they were very much two sides of the same coin.
Yeah. And what made you want to transition to becoming a software developer in particular?
Sure. So for me, 13 years in, teaching is quite a grind. And I loved teaching, the teaching aspect, this, working with students and inspiring. But realistically, there is a lot more to the job. As with any job, when you're 18 years old and you're looking into what you're going to do, there's the things that you know are part of the job, and there's the things that you find out eventually are part of the job. And there was a lot of bureaucracy in teaching. I talk a lot with people that sort of work for the government and work for military, and they talk about the frustrations of bureaucracy. And then I would tell them about stuff going on in school districts, and they would say, yeah, it sounds just like that. and it just, there was a lot of sort of daily grind frustrations that that took up more and more of my day. And then life changed, and we had kids, and I wanted to be able to spend more time with my kids. One of the sort of inciting incidents was, you would think as a teacher that you would be able to go to all of sort of your kids' exciting life events, but I was a band teacher, and so my son went to his preschool graduation, and I couldn't go. And I mean, it's silly, but like, I couldn't take off because I was running a graduation for my students at the same time. And so I missed it. And that was not the only thing that was like that. The other thing was, you think as a teacher, oh, you have summers off and you have nights and weekends. And that was never the case for me. I was always working all the time, getting stuff ready, which I loved. Again, it was a passion. But I was working all the time, and I wasn't necessarily being appreciated for that. It wasn't like teachers get paid overtime. You do it because you love it, which I did. But I then got inspired by picking up an iPhone. Actually, I was brought into kicking, screaming, which was the funny story was, I had a flip phone for years, and my being for the flip phone was that I needed to not lose it. And I basically never used it. It was there for emergencies. And when iPhone and just general smartphones came out, I thought, well, why am I going to pay more for something that's just sort of a daily frustration? And then I got pulled into it kicking and screaming, and then I tried it, and I thought, this is the greatest thing ever. Look what this thing can do. And then lo and behold, it's to create things, you need Objective-C. Oh, well, I grew up and I knew how to code in C. Again, my background, it's not just somebody who has no idea what was going on. I did a lot of coding when I was little and as a teenager. So I knew how to code in C, and I thought, oh, I could actually create things for this. And so part of it was the grind of teaching started wearing me down. And part of it was, I could do something that's amazing with the other set of my personal skills. And so that was sort of my reasoning for changing careers. But then obviously, as I assume we're going to talk about next, is it's not that easy.
Yeah.
It's sort of a snap of the fingers of like, okay, cool, I'm doing a different career.
And how do you think being a school teacher prepared you for your role as a software developer?
Sure. Well, one of the nice things when I did transition careers, there's, when you go into a new career with a different career in your background, there's definitely some disadvantages, and there's definitely some advantages. One of the nice advantages was I had spent many years running an organization, right? And talking to people and talking to crowds. And again, I was for the largest part of my career, I was a band teacher. So I was working with 30 students or 50 students or 100 students. It depended on the side of the group. And a lot of my career was spent with middle school and high school students, and especially middle school. And the term that I've heard a lot is herding cats. Getting 100 middle school students to all go in the same direction, either literally or figuratively, is a challenging thing. And so being able to organize groups and speak to groups was a huge advantage that a lot of people sort of starting out in tech, that's not their strength. That's not what they like doing. And actually, realistically, in hindsight, I found out it's not really what I like doing either. But I did it for a long time, and I have some skills. I took classes in college, and like I said, I have a lot of experience with it. Now that I've transitioned careers for many years. I don't miss it. I like the idea of you have a deadline and having a small amount of very reliable people that you know can get things done, and not having to always worry about all of the contingency plans for when things don't work. Although that's part of the job too. So anyway, that was, so I had advantages that people who just are starting out in tech did not have. Now, on the flip side, I had disadvantages as well in that, like I said, I think I was maybe 6 or 7 years old, and my grandfather, who worked for the Navy with computers and all sorts of stuff, he showed up at our doorstep with an Apple IIe, boxes of Apple IIe computer, and my mom said, "What is all this stuff?" And it was probably more graphic than that, and said, "What is all this stuff? These boxes, and what are we going to do with it?" And he said, "Don't worry about it. Greg will figure it out. This is something that he will love." And he was right. And with the one exception that Apple IIe, which obviously the vast majority of my business now is Apple products, but I could not stand that thing for years because I would go to a store to buy games, as all kids would do, Egghead store or whatever the different computer stores were, and they'd have 3.5 walls worth of great stuff for PC. Although I don't remember if they called it PC then, but
they did. Yeah, I remembered going to those stores too, and having the same experience. And I did have a PC, fortunately. Yeah.
Yeah, and they'd have like a shelf and a half of Apple.
Yeah.
and it was so far inferior games, or it just looked inferior. I mean, I don't really know, but so then that's why I learned to actually code, because the games were not that exciting.
You had a great background playing with computers, gaming, and of course, combining that with your teaching experience. What was your first role as a software developer like then, given all of this experience?
Sure. So when I decided to change careers, I was working as a teacher during the day, and at night I was learning, because the big thing that I had to do changing careers is, while I had coded as a kid, I had a lot to learn. Mm-hmm. So I was learning at night and I was teaching during the day, and I first started working on websites, and I was doing things that were sort of very simple and that were for sort of friends and family, people I knew, and I was just trying to sort of start something, right? Mm-hmm. And get some kind of a revenue flow. And I knew at the time I wasn't really excited about that. Again, my excitement was this thing that you could put in your hand and put in your pocket, and just that it could create stuff. And I wasn't as excited about website stuff, although obviously there's amazing stuff that people do with that. But that wasn't what I wanted to do, but I did need to start a career somewhere. Mm-hmm. So I started doing that, and I was working with some sort of smaller companies, and I was just helping out where I could. And a lot of what I could do right away was be sort of a bridge between the user and the coder, mm-hmm. the coders who were already on team or such, because I knew students, I knew people, I knew behavior, and I knew how to explain what I was talking about to people. So my skills from teaching really helped in that initial job.
Yeah. And then, keep going. Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say, and so then I shortly after that, I had gained enough knowledge that then I could actually do what I really wanted to do, which was work on Android and iOS, and to be able to start creating.
Yeah. And given that you were working, like you said, some friends and family, some companies or small businesses, what made you want to transition from that to becoming a freelance developer?
Sure. Well, there was actually one step in between. So at that, this is at the point where we were about 2 years out from the presidential election. So it was probably 2010-ish, okay? And I had this idea that if people knew more about people running for office, that they might vote what was really, truly good for them and really, truly understand. And I felt like people didn't quite, there's that whole mob mentality and people get really excited about sort of personalities. But I thought, it would be great. And to help people understand what they're really voting for, because I didn't even know, right? I mean, and it's so easy to kind of get swept up in the excitement of a candidate or whatnot. So I thought, okay, I have this idea. If someone has in their hand something where they can see all the things about different candidates and all the things about their specific races and not necessarily just president, because, you go into the voting booth and there's like 19 things. And by the time you get down to the end, you're like, I don't know, who is that person? Who has the nicer sounding name? I mean, I hope people don't do that, but maybe they do. So I had that idea and I thought, okay, I can make an app that does that. And I can really reach people and I can do this exciting thing. And I had all these sort of great ideas. I thought, okay, so I'm going to put out this app and I'm going to start with the presidential candidates and then I'm going to file down. And so I did that and I had enough knowledge to sort of get it going. And I did this for myself. So this wasn't freelance. And then little by little, it was a huge learning experience over those almost 2 years. It grew from president, which you're talking about at the beginning, maybe like 5 to 10 people, then to Senate, then to House, then to every state Senate, then to every state House, which, wow, was it a learning experience. I had no idea that every state does everything different and they don't even call them the same things. And anyway, it was crazy. But it was a huge learning experience because I had to learn, how do you scale up? And so I did, and I had to learn how to work with servers and backends. And anyway, so it was a very huge learning experience, and I learned so much that I still use today in that experience. But and I got featured by Apple. We were on the what's hot or whatever that list was, and I had tons of users, and it was awesome. But I had two big problems looking back on it. One, I had no idea how to monetize. None. Which is such a huge thing that now obviously I deal with all the time with clients is, okay, you have this great idea. How are you going to make money? Because if you don't make money, you don't have a product. And I had none. Like that was one problem. And I ran ads and I did some other stuff, but I had no strategy. The other problem was that the day after the 2012 election, I went from million users or millions of users to none. To like, okay, no one cares. What are you going to do? And so the initial question was, how did you get into freelance? That's how I got into freelance.
Yeah, so you discovered you had all these skills, you could build the app, you could scale it, but the business side was a little tricky for you.
Exactly. And honestly, I didn't want to be involved in the business side. I wanted to make something cool, and I want somebody else to figure out how to make it sell. And
I think that's a really valuable lesson, because I think too often people want to do it all, and then they realize it's more about honing their craft and less about doing it all, but finding a good partner or finding good clients that will let you then hone your craft.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the nice things about doing that project was putting on every single hat. And then, like you said, realizing I don't like half those hats. Wouldn't it be great if I didn't have to do every single one of those? Like, I don't love doing the back end stuff. And I don't love, figuring out how to market. Like, I don't know how to do that. And people really know how to do that well. I'm not one of them. And sort of figuring that out, like, okay, what are my strengths and what are my weaknesses? And how can I find people who have the, different strengths and weaknesses so that we can make a team? And again, bringing it back to my background as a band director, for the most part, you have all these different instruments in a band. How do you make them all work together? And they all do different things. And how do you make something together that's more magical than you could possibly make by yourself?
Yeah, that's a really great analogy. Thank you. So, how did you go about getting that first client then after you had gone through this experience of trying to do everything on your own?
Sure. So again, word of mouth, talking to people that I knew. So I think my first clients, again, in that field, in the field that I'm currently in, were sort of friends and family, and just or two or three hops down the chain of people. Oh, I know this person who knows this person, and so that was sort of the original. But then I found a freelance website, and I'm trying to think. At the time, it was Elance.
Hmm.
It's now since morphed into Upwork,
Hmm.
bought out, etc. But it was Elance, and so I started, putting my stuff up on there and going through the whole process of sort of applying for just jobs and jobs and jobs, which was really great because in 2012, that was probably now 2013, because that was the end. There was lots of jobs, just lots and lots of jobs, and so I put my stuff out there. My hourly was tiny, and I was just basically willing to work. Like,
Actually, yeah. So, I wanted to ask you about that. How did you go about pricing yourself in that first project?
sure. So at first, so basically what I did is I just did tons of research, and I tried to
Hmm.
figure out, okay, what do people charge for this skill, and what are the things that they're doing? Because obviously, like, make an app is like a huge umbrella. Like, can you make an app that takes 2 months? Can you make an app that takes 2 years? Can it do, one very small targeted thing? Can it do, the Swiss army of apps, which there
Hmm.
are plenty of. So I just did a lot of research, and I tried to figure, okay, what do people charge for this? And then to start with, I was willing to take much less, right?
Hmm.
Than sort of what the average was, because I was starting and I really was hungry, right? I just wanted something. And at first, I definitely was less interested in sort of what I was excited about personally, and more just, I needed a job.
Yeah.
um, so yeah, that was about it.
You were kind of focused on like building up your portfolio, maybe having some reference clients that you could point
Absolutely.
to. So, what did you learn from that first project that you worked on?
The first project I worked on was a baseball app,
Hmm.
and I had this connection that with all projects, I do try to have some kind of personal connection and something that really makes me fall in love with the project and do it the best I could possibly do it. Now, for this one, baseball is not necessarily, or at least at the time, was not a passion of mine, but it was a passion of my father's. That was his love. And I'm named after a baseball player. Unfortunately, I was not the greatest baseball player, but this was something I did have a connection in, and sadly, he had passed away recently at the time, and so this was sort of something in his honor, and I was really excited to be able to be involved in something that I had a passion in. So I learned a lot on that project. One of the things I think I learned the most was understanding change orders and requests for change.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to that, like I said, I was working for a lot of sort of friends and family, and people were sort of like very understanding of like, okay, well, we could just do it in whatever makes sense, the best possible way. And this was one of my first couple projects where it was a client, and they were like, no, I really want it this way.
Hmm.
And so we had a lot of conversations about things like, well, okay, Apple has rules. They have a document called the HIG, which is the Human Interface Guideline. And I agree with you. It would be so much better if we did it that way. We can't do it that way. There's no way we'll get on the store. And if you can't get on the store, then you don't have an app, and then you don't, So, but we changed lots of stuff,
Hmm.
a lot, and we changed also a lot of stuff after getting rejected. One of the interesting things I would say that I did not realize before going into this career is sort of how much you're sort of at the feet of Apple, and you get rejected by Apple, and they can just decide one day, well, they don't like this this way, or they want the buttons to be further away from the edge than you do. And they're usually like for a good reason. But explaining that to a client sometimes is challenging. And so I learned a lot on that project about changing things, trying to find a good medium between you, the client, and the rules. They're always sort of in there. And then also, it was the beginning of me really realizing how, as a coder, you have to code flexibly. And you have to sort of guess that you're probably going to change the color scheme 8 times, and you're probably going to move things around, 4 times, and you're maybe this screen is second or third in sort of the sequence of things now, but it might be 8th or it might be first. And definitely on those first couple projects, there were times where it was like, okay, we want to move that button, and I'm thinking, oh no.
I do the whole thing over again. Yeah.
The entire thing has to be blown up to do that. And at the time, obviously, those were the things where it was conversations like, okay, we can do that, but that's 2 weeks worth of work. And they'd be like, what, 2 weeks for a button? It's like, yeah. And where now, as doing this long enough, I can most of the time, not always, but most of the time sort of guess where we're going with things and code in a flexible way where it's like, yeah, if we have to move this to the the other side of the page, or we have to move this to the 9th page in the sequence, no big deal, right?
Yeah.
We're not breaking everything to do that. But at first,
right. I bet that first year was pretty challenging for you to, like, 1, discover those things about your own craft of coding, and then 2, discover the ecosystem you're in, the Apple ecosystem or the iOS ecosystem, and then 3, be able to interact with clients in a way where you want to keep the project alive, you want to contribute, you want to do a good job, but you have to deliver bad news from time to time. I'm wondering what other challenges came up in that first year, and how did you stay motivated and kind of push through it?
Sure. Well, as for motivation and pushing through, so I'm an obsessive kind of person. So I get sort of very, very involved in the task at hand, and I get very focused. So when I took on those initial jobs, I remember thinking like, okay, I've signed on. I am now going to do everything to get this to be good, okay? Because as you mentioned about building portfolio and such, I really wanted to make sure that those first couple of jobs, I did it 110%, and that I could get those 5-star ratings no matter what. No matter how hard I had to work, no matter how many things I had to do on the weekends or nights, just to really obsessively figure it out. So that's sort of just something that's innately me, that helped. And I assume lots of people are like that. And so, but I also knew going into it, that was part of the bargain, right? Is that, okay, when I left the teaching, I'm going to leave it out in the field, right? I'm going to do everything and anything. And so the things you mentioned about sort of dealing with clients and learning the Apple ecosystem, I also did an Android app in the first year, which is a whole nother thing. And there's all different rules. And of course, especially Android at that time was pretty much the Wild West. It was like, yeah, you do whatever you want. Like, we don't care. But still, there was definitely, it was Java, which I knew some, but it wasn't like, I definitely had all of those problems that coders have where I was writing sort of Objective-C code in Java and vice versa, where I would just mix up stuff like, oh yeah, that one you can't use over here. Oh, no, wait, what do they call that in this? And I got super into Googling Stack Overflow and just on stuff where, one of the things that I always find interesting when I watch videos of other coders is sort of how difficult the career of a coder is, and how it always is so you never feel like you know anything. I think you're always like looking up stuff and you're like, oh, that's the stupidest thing. How do I not know that? Right? And on the other hand, I love Stack Overflow for that, because it's like, I should know that, but I don't, because there's 100 million things to know.
Oh, of course.
So like, wait, how do I do this? Boom, it's sitting right there. It's like, oh yeah, I knew I know that, or I knew that, but like my brain is not working today. And so, and even today, I mean, I've been doing this, I think 9 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you can't possibly know everything. And so you definitely can't get into a mindset that like it's bad to need help. Like I
Mm-hmm.
hope you need help. And it's just it's such a hard career in so many ways, but there's a lot of people there to help you. And there's a lot of resources. I mean, I can't imagine how coders worked sort of like in the 80s and earlier.
Well, the good news is they didn't have to deal with as much in terms of complexity, right?
Sure.
Like users and being in the cloud and
Yeah,
dealing with various ecosystems, like you said, Android, iOS. So I kind of feel like they had
absolutely.
it a little bit easier. Yeah.
In some ways, although another passion of mine is I love learning. That was a big reason why I went into teaching. So I read books and books and books and books. And I love reading coding books from like the 60s and the 70s. And it's amazing how relevant it is. Like they were working on these computer systems that like, I think it's funny. And my kids, when they see like in movies, like, where it's like computers from the 70s or even like
Right.
an office computer in the 80s, and they're like, what is that thing? It's like this screen with just some words on it, and it just looks all old fashioned. And
Yeah. And no internet. Yeah.
yeah, right. But they were dealing with all of the same problems and all of the same complexities, but they had like basically nowhere to go,
Yeah.
nowhere simply to go for help. Like, okay, what is the best way to organize things? Or what is, how do you do this? And I mean, it is amazing that in the 60s and 70s, you read these books and they're having the same problems we have now. And they actually have some good ideas on how to solve them. Some really, really good ideas. And you would think like, how could a program that looks like what programs look like have anything to do with this sort of like graphically intensive, crazy thing? And it's like, it has everything to do with that.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to get some of your book suggestions and put them in the show notes.
Sure.
So coming back to the life of a freelancer now, I know that one of the challenges, aside from, like you just mentioned, honing your craft, continuing to learn, having enough resources, is also making sure you have a steady stream of clients and really building up that pipeline. How did you go about doing this?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the first part we touched upon a minute ago or recently, a couple minutes ago, which is just if you do really good work for your clients, things come back to you because word of mouth happens, other projects with the same clients. So that really helps. And again, every project I take, I feel like I sign my name on the dotted line and it's like, okay, I am going to make this work. And I'm going to be there on, in every way that I can be to make this successful. Now that doesn't always happen, and that's a whole other question, right?
Yeah. Actually, that's the next question. It's like, how do you even gauge if there is a fit with a client? Because that's really important. Your initial projects, like you said, may make sense to take on people who you mostly trust, and you're willing to do that 110%. But then when you get to a place where maybe you have a lot of people coming at you, which is a good place to be, that word of mouth, and then some of the websites for freelancers, what do you do to gauge and make sure you're working on the projects that you want to work on and with the clients who see eye to eye?
Sure. Yeah, and that's a very good question. And it changes. I think that's the kind of thing. I had a professor in college, and we talked about, and it was for education, but talked about always writing sort of like where you're at and what your goals are every so often, every 3 months, every 6 months. And I don't necessarily do it in a written form, but I very much think sort of what's important to me at this stage of my career. And, and like you pointed out, it's different at different stages. So at the moment, there's a lot of things that go into that decision. I definitely want to work with people that are good to work with. I do think, having a good relationship, being able to talk to people and communicate is really important. And I think having the client have a have a really clear vision of what they want to do. At this point in my career, I'm a little less for the sort of ride of we'll get there.
Right.
Because I've seen enough of projects that have not been successful to realize, when people say, okay, I have this great idea. And then I say, okay, well, so how are you going to monetize it and how are you going to market it? And what's the first steps? And when the app is out in the world, what are we going to do next? And when they say, I don't know, a lot of times that's like, okay, well, you need to figure that stuff out and come back to me, right?
Yeah.
But I'm not going to waste your money and my time sort of, wandering down a path where we have no idea where we're going. And a lot of times, like, they have great ideas. And a lot of times, you said, how do you pick a project? I really want to do something that's exciting for me. And so for me, that means something that's helping people, whether it's like healthcare, which I love working on, things like that, or music, or just generally some kind of connection to me, whether it has to do with something with being a parent with my kids, or baseball in the situation with my dad, or something that's exciting. But I've definitely turned down in the last couple of years some really great projects because it either wasn't right, they didn't have a direction. I also try to be really honest, am I the right person for this job? Because, I don't want to get into a situation where it's, what they really needed for the job is not really what I do.
Right.
And I wanted to be that perfect fit. Again, the beginning of my career, that was not as much. It was like, okay, you need this puzzle piece. I will become that puzzle piece, Yeah,
and that's good to help you kind of stretch as a freelancer and, like you said, kind of build up your arsenal. So I'm curious though, because you've been doing this for 9 years,
Sure.
and hope you'll give our audience a little bit of a break here.
Sure.
Was there ever a time where you did have to end a contract, and how did you do it gracefully? You kind of dipped your toe into the project, got started, and then realized, oh, I sort of misgauged this and I'm not the right person, or this isn't the right project for me.
Sure. Well, I've had less experience with that and more experience with projects that sort of fizzled out.
Okay. Yeah.
And more with projects where, we had mentioned the idea of what's success, and where, they were a success. I did a project that I absolutely loved. And it was the best product out there of what it did. And unfortunately, the App Store is so big, it's so big that it never took traction. And so unfortunately, in one way, you could say it's a success because we made a great product. And this was, I only did part of the project, obviously. It was a team. But we just could not get traction. And I don't understand that. And that's part of why I don't do that, right? Is that I don't understand how an app takes off and how it doesn't.
Right.
My projects have, and a lot of them have not. And I mean, to me, a person who is good at marketing, who is good at publicizing, is worth their weight in gold. I mean, because I honestly, sadly, I kind of think at this point, you could probably put out a mediocre product, a great marketing team, and be way better off than making something where I'm so proud that we made an amazing product and no one used it.
Yeah, so that's an unfortunate series of events because you put a lot of energy into this and you're excited, but then the product just doesn't end up getting traction. How do you go about conveying that to a future client when maybe they're asking you like, hey, I noticed you worked on like 5 products, but I only see 3 in the App Store. What happened to the other 2?
Sure. One of the things that at this point in my career that I feel is actually a big asset to my clients is that I'm going to be very honest with them up front. That, look, most tech projects fail.
Yep.
There's a billion ways to fail, and there's very few avenues to succeed. Now, when you succeed, that's amazing, right? And that's what everybody wants, and it's there. It's not impossible.
Right.
But you need to go in this having every single thing that you could possibly have on your side helping you out. and maybe you have a chance. But you cannot go into a project thinking like, I have the greatest idea ever and it will just succeed.
Yeah.
Probably.
And I remember when we started working together, we were pretty forthright with each other because I had also told you, like, there's some tech debt in this. Actually, I don't think I said some. I said, there's a lot of tech debt in this project. So how do you go about evaluating the scope of work? Because I think a lot of times, like you said, maybe there's a mediocre product, but people really need to hone it, or they have a strong vision or a strong marketing team, but you're just not super excited, or you're concerned around how long it's going to take because there are things like tech debt, or they might be using a new framework that you're not familiar with.
Yeah, so it's definitely something that I've learned along the way. So I've seen sort of the gamut of sort of projects that are, out in the world or are about to be launched that I've been approached to pick up. And so some of them, I literally had one project where the coder was brilliant. And I was like, this is amazing. Like, okay, like, let's do this. And I know exactly what they're doing. It's so clear. It's so well done. But that is the exception, not the rule. And so there's definitely, I've also seen projects where I look at it and just go, oh my God, this is a disaster. A disaster to such a level, like, maybe we just throw it all out. And actually, there have definitely been times in my career where I've taken project and suggested exactly that, which is like, this just all needs to go. We need to start over. And then, which is a
tough call to make. So how do you make that kind of call?
So I've made that call in the past, and honestly, what I would say is, at this point in my career, I would say I try to do everything not to do that.
Okay. Yeah. So gauge the project ahead of time so that you don't get to a point where you need to make that call.
Or, well, and not so much that I wouldn't even take the project, but if I'm going to take the project, not to throw it all in the trash at once. So I did a project pretty early on in my career, and it was a disaster. It was of code, and it was just, and I said, okay, just dump it. We just need to start over. And I learned the hard way that in that mess was a whole lot of business logic and a whole lot of things that were not scoped in the job that we talked about. So I redid the app. I did everything exactly as was scoped out and we talked about. And then they said, but what about the part where it does this? And I've never heard of that before. Oh, and what about the part that did this? And what part that does this? And the project went on forever, because there were so many things that the original app did very, very badly that suddenly they wanted done well, and the project, it was a very bad situation that I got myself into because I didn't, the code was such a disaster. I didn't really understand and nothing really worked. So I couldn't just go figure out myself all of the many things that the app was supposed to do.
Right.
So what I've learned along the way is, in a disastrous project, if you're going to take it on, right? Obviously, knowing when to just walk away is an important skill as well. But if you're going to take it on, to compartmentalize as much as possible. I took on a project just recently that the code was really quite ugly and quite old. I mean, we're talking about 7-8 years old. So,
oh, wow.
So basically, to the early days of iOS. And I thought, looking at it, if this is me in 2012, 2013, I'm like, trash, start over.
Yeah.
There's just no why. And so, but this is me now. And even though in my line, my specific line, I do most of my work in Swift now, and I really don't touch Objective-C much at all. And then this was all Objective-C, obviously, because that's all that existed. I kept almost everything to start with. And then I compartmentally just updated what needed to be updated. And then all of the stuff that was just really ugly, I tried to sort of fit into boxes so that it's there, it's ugly. If we want to update it, I can do it without destroying everything else. And it came in huge. It really came in handy because like every project, we got to sort of the point where we were ready to send, and we did, and people tested it out, and it was great. And then they said, oh, the old app had this skill where you could tap a button and go in and then see the data if you were an admin with an admin password. You could go in and see the data. And it was a nice little interface. And I thought, well, it wasn't on any of the specs. I've never heard of this before. Okay. And luckily, though, since I compartmentalized the code was still there.
Yeah.
It kind of worked, actually.
Right.
If I needed to then redo an entire new interface that then tapped into the database a different way and then showed a user and did the whole password thing, that would have taken a lot more than 2 days. Mm-hmm. And because I sort of had that experience of knowing, like, don't throw it out. It's so tempting to don't throw it out, that I did it. It took me like a half hour, an hour. Mm-hmm. Which is, when you get a change order, for me, it's rare for it to just take a half hour, an hour. Normally it's like, okay, we've never talked about that. That might be big, but this was great. And it was all about experience of knowing, And
that experience helps you then set expectations with your client for what is a reasonable time frame to get this done, or what may have to be deferred until maybe V1 or the beta version comes out first.
Yes. And setting expectations, which I don't think I've touched upon too much, but that's a huge part of my job. Mm-hmm. Because so much in tech, and everybody in tech, I'm sure, sees this and experiences this, so much in tech looks really easy.
Right.
That's when people are awesome at what they do.
Yeah.
They make it look easy.
Yeah.
And so, people pick up a device and they tap on some buttons and they just think, oh, that's easy. And it's almost never easy. Yeah. And so one of the best things I think that you can do as someone working in tech for a client is just set up their expectations. Say, look, we're going to do this and it's going to be great, but it's not going to be a straight line from A to B. It's going to be bumpy. And there's going to be things where you're going to say, but I really wanted to do this, where you really, as a client, should listen to the people, whether it's the UX people or the graphic design people, or it's me or whatever, or the back end people, that you should listen. And the best projects I've worked on were all about collaboration. Mm-hmm. Okay, we want it to do this. This is its main job.
Right.
Here's our starting off point. Like, here's our first attempt. But don't think that's going to be the final one. Like, if you're so, ingrained on that's what it has to be, you're going to spend a lot of money and you're probably not going to be that happy with the end result, or at least to say you're not going to be as happy as what it could be if you listen to the people around you. Because I can't tell you how many times I've talked to, been in conversations where it's like, okay, we have this problem and we're going to try to fix it. And then you go to the UI people and they say, okay, well, let's try this. And then the digital, and then the coders, and everybody has sort of like, yeah, if we do it that way, it's hard and it's going to, and then, but if you actually value everyone's opinion,
right,
and their input, you come up with these things where, like, oh yeah, we could do that. Oh yeah, let's change it that way. That's 5 minutes, The other thing was 6 days. 5 minutes. And a big part of that is just listening to each other and accepting help from others, which I guess I'll come back to sort of the beginning where I mentioned earlier, where I mentioned Stack Overflow.
Yeah.
I think a big part of tech is understanding you're a cog, you're a part, and understanding, like I said, the thing about marketing and publicity, you're not always the most important part. In fact, you're often not even close to the most important part. And accepting that, and accepting help from others and input from others. Yeah. And that's how you make a successful project with a little luck.
Right. Yeah, it's getting different. I think having different people come together who have varied experiences and may know a little bit more than you in some areas than others, and you figure out where you fit in. And along those lines, though, our experience is constantly changing. And I'm curious, given that things in tech move quickly as well, how do you keep track of new frameworks or languages so that you stay relevant, so that you can be part of those conversations and contribute effectively?
Sure. So I read a lot, like I said. So I read a lot. I watch tons and tons of videos, and I schedule into my week. I attempt to schedule in my week.
Yeah.
As part of the week, right? Now, obviously, like launch week, or like there's times where it's just like, okay, I'm staying up to all hours to get this thing right, and so it doesn't happen those weeks. But for the most part, I try to have learning be a big part of it, and again, that's a big help for my background. I love learning.
Yeah.
I love teaching people to learn. That was part of what I loved about my former career. So in this career, that's just a part of it. And things do change like crazy.
Right.
I mean, the stuff that I was doing in 2012 and 2013 is completely different than what I'm doing now. And it's changing all the time. And it's changing not only for the specifics, but also, I'm doing another Android project now. I actually hadn't done one for a while. And I'm also looking into possibly learning some other things like native React, or React Native, because so many people ask me about that.
Right.
So then it's like, oh, well, maybe I should learn that.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on with that. And so sort of just be open for change.
Yeah. And prioritize learning, it sounds like, when you kind of carve it out in your schedule.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because if you don't keep learning, you will get left behind.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Tech is crazy like that. Like teaching was interesting. There were teachers that they taught the same way they did 40 years earlier.
I met some computer science professors who do that as well. So I don't think it's limited to middle school, high school. Now,
Sure.
Yeah. And speaking of kind of carving out time, right, in addition to learning, I know you're a dad. So how do you also balance work with your family time and make sure that clients aren't overstepping their bounds in terms of how much time they're asking for you, or kind of pushing you like, hey, Greg, we need to get this thing to the app store in the next week. We need you to pull an all-nighter.
Sure. It's very hard. Balance is a very hard thing. And again, for me personally, I'm very obsessive about stuff. So yeah, if there's a project that things need to get done, I've always been the kind of person where I will drop everything and get it done. I'll do the same thing, obviously, with family, and I'll do the same thing with sort of all aspects of my life. So those things kind of cause the problem sometimes, right? There are conflicts. I will say one of the greatest things about my job is the flexibility. It's really just, being a freelancer is very hard. And so if someone's thinking about going into this and they're thinking about the positives, kind of like I said about teaching, there's the positives that I knew going into it, and there's some of the negatives that I did not realize till I was in it. The negative is that balance is hard. It's really hard. And someone can tell you that beforehand, and it's even harder than you think. But the flexibility is wonderful. My kids, when they go on field trips to different exciting things, I've pretty much been able to go on all of their field trips.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah.
Which is amazing. And and when things come up, they have concerts or they have performances or games or whatever, pretty much I can be there. That might mean I'm working all night or all weekend, or, so if something comes up, I have to juggle. And sometimes that balance can drive you to the point of insanity, where it's just like, oh my God, I did like a 70-hour work week on top of all this other stuff that I'm doing. And, but it's flexibility. So there's flexibility. So I can do that, and I can change my schedule around, and I can also, within reason, I can say, okay, I worked like crazy for 3 months. I'm going to work a little less this month. So
and
again,
you have that freedom to do that because no one's telling you, hey, Greg, you got to like go out and take on 5 more projects. You can say no. Yeah.
Now that's always easier said than done because,
of course,
projects come back to you and you're like, oh, I love that project. Oh, there's no way I'm saying no. That was, I love that client and they need me. And, so it's easier said than done a lot of times. Also, it's easier said than done because coming back to, I think, something I said about feast or famine,
right?
Even today, where I've done this for a long time, there are some times where it's like, okay, I just finished up these couple of projects. I have no idea what's next, and so it's like, okay, I got to get back to trying to find what's next. And invariably, it's almost always like, okay, I have nothing. I have 10 things. And I can't possibly balance that and family and everything going on. But I have to figure that out. So that is part of the job, being a freelancer. It's part of the job of being a business owner, right?
Right.
And the good and the bad, you get both.
Yeah.
And so
I feel like we should do a follow-up episode, kind of dive into that. But I think we've given our audience here a lot of good stuff in this episode.
Awesome.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Greg, for coming on the show and sharing your insights. How can people get in touch with you if they either want to work with you or learn more?
Sure. The best way would be through my website, which is twosuntraders.com, which has my email on there. And Two Sun Traders is kind of it was a play on words years and years ago that originally was funny. And at this point, I've had to spell it so many times that it's so that in hindsight, maybe not the best name, but it's two like the number, sun like the sun in the sky, and traders like someone who would trade something. And it's a play on, I live in Tucson and I have 2 sons. And
nice.
So it was a play on words on a bunch of stuff. But anyway, so that's where that comes from.
Well, don't worry. We'll include the link in the show notes so that people can have easy access to it. That's it for this episode of Build. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to receive more episodes like today's, and share this with a friend, a teammate, or anyone you know who is curious about becoming a freelancer and help them get their start. Ciao for now. Build is brought to you by amazing patrons. Our platinum patrons are Andrea Goulet, CEO and co-founder of Corgi Bites; Charbel Saman, founder of Sprintwell; Dee Gill, founder of Chime On; Jamie Hand, and Lauren Hassan, CEO and founder of Developer, as well as the following patrons. If you'd like to join them and support Build, please visit patreon.com/build. In exchange for your support, you'll receive perks like advanced copies of our books from authors highlighted on the show, special pricing on upcoming FemJunior courses, and more.